Time for everything, huh? It means that there's the wrong time for some things. And the right time indicates that you need to make a decision. It doesn't come with a pre-set of knowledge that you can just walk along with. You do have to make decisions, and getting it right is pretty important. Now, a few weeks ago, I heard a little story. It's not meant to be taken too seriously, but I feel it kind of illustrates this point, so I'm just going to share it with you. A man got stuck in a blizzard, and he was quite a long way from a town, so he was in a bit of danger. And the snow went right up to his waist. And when it got that bad, he thought it was time to pray. He was a man of faith, so he prayed a very sincere prayer, which was, "Please, God, please, I'm in terrible trouble. Send an angel to rescue me." And that man's confidence and belief was so strong that he was looking around for that angel. He was absolutely certain that angel was going to come. But no angel came. A taxi arrived, though, and the taxi driver got out, went over to the man and saw the situation, and he said, "Look, this is terrible. I'll get my shovel, I'll dig you up, I'll get you into the car, and I'll take you home, and I won't even charge you." And to the taxi driver's utter astonishment, the man said, "No, go away. I'm fine. I'm fine. I've asked for an angel, and if you're here, the angel won't come, so please go away." So despite the remonstrations that the taxi driver gave, the man was not going to move. He was not going to get in that taxi. So the taxi driver gave up and left. So the snow now was rising, and it was right up to the man's chest. So the situation was getting a little bit more perilous. And again, the man thought, well, I better hurry God up here because this is getting serious. So it was, "Please, God, send the angel pretty soon. Things are getting bad." And again, he waited for the angel, and again, there was no angel, but a second taxi pulled up. Now, the taxi driver got out, saw the situation, same as the first one, did his best to get the man dug out and put into the car and taken to safety, but he was having none of it. The second time, he was having none of it, and he sent the taxi driver on his way. Well, by now, the snow was up to here. And the man realized it was sink or swim situation, live or die. So he did one final prayer. "Please, God, if you don't send that angel soon, I shall surely perish." Well, again, no angel, but a third taxi arrived. And the taxi driver got out and once again tried to dig him out and get him into the taxi, but nope, he wasn't having any of it. And he remained there. So the taxi driver left. He was covered with snow and he perished. Rotten end to a story, really. But on the day of the resurrection, let's just imagine that it had happened. He woke up and he went to find God and he sought him out, and immediately he started to kind of complain. "God, I trusted you. I asked for your help and you didn't help me, and I died in the snow and I wasn't ready to go at that time." And God looked at him and he said, "My dear son, I sent you 3 taxis. What more do you want?" And I just think, isn't that just what we are like sometimes? Did you notice the prayer? It had such an arrogance to it. There's a plea for God to help, but a set of instructions on how he should do it. Send an angel, and that's all I'm going to accept. I don't care what else happens. I've asked for an angel. That's what I believe you're going to do, and that's all I will accept. It's why I love the book of Ecclesiastes so much. I love that book. I mean, many people find it a little bit maybe depressing, but for me, it's very grounding. It's very much a case of there's nothing new under the sun. God tells us, I've already been here, I've created it, and even your Einsteins and your scientists and your people who win the Nobel Prize, all they're doing is discovering what I put there. So get over yourself, you're not all that. I like that very much because I think we all need that message from time to time. I think that the right moment and the right time is kind of linked to your life's journey. And I think it's also linked to the decisions that we make. A time for. So when you're presented with one of those time for moments, there's 3 different responses that you can have. I think the first one is that you might be called to action. You might have to do something. The second one, you might need to speak up. Or it could be that you need to plot a course that's a little bit different to the one you're on. But it could also be the polar opposite. You could be required to sit down and restrain yourself from taking action. Maybe you need to sit down and stop speaking and give somebody else a turn. Maybe you need to stay on the course that's already plotted because that's the right one. It's pretty tricky, isn't it? But I think probably, actually certainly, amongst the congregation here today, there have been time for moments when things would have improved for you, but you may have let those moments pass in order to help somebody else that you love. Maybe you didn't go and take an opportunity because you knew that the people you would leave behind would be worse off because you weren't there. Lots of people make selfless decisions their whole life through, and there may be just this little kind of voice that says, what if? What if I had done that? Right, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, and I'm talking about the 1946 version in black and white. But I'm going to give you a synopsis of this because I think it illustrates this part of my talk very, very well. It's set in a little town in America called Bedford Falls, and the main character is George Bailey. Now, George Bailey's biggest wish is to get away from that town as quickly as he can. He wants to go to university. He wants to travel the world. He wants to see everything. He wants to do everything. He wants to be this amazing man with a great trail of success behind him. But George Bailey never leaves Bedford Falls. The night before he is due to go to college, which he saved up for, his father dies of a heart attack. And he knows that if he leaves, his father's business, the Building and Loan Society, will fold because there's no one else to run it. And the family needs it, and also the town needs it. So George lets his moment, his time for, slip away. And instead, he gives the money to his younger brother, who goes off to college and does all the things that George wanted to do. And George Bailey is stuck in Bedford Falls, even more so because he married a girl from there who didn't want to leave. So that was his lot in life. And he did it very grudgingly. He didn't really want it, but he knew it was the right thing to do, so he made that decision to stay. And things trotted along for several years, and then all of a sudden, it went horribly wrong. His dippy old uncle, who really was pretty much unemployable anywhere else, he managed to lose $8,000 on the way to the bank before he could deposit it. And in the 1940s, $8,000, that's worth, I don't know, what, $1 million? A lot of cash. And the bank examiner had arrived, and somebody was either going to produce the money or go to prison for embezzlement. And you might have got the gist of George Bailey's character. He was not going to let his uncle go to prison. He was going to take the fall, but he was so bitter. He was so angry. And all those feelings of resentment bubbled up inside of him and came flooding out at the surface. And he had a complete meltdown. And he found that he had, in his pocket of his jacket, he had a life insurance policy. And he realized that he was actually worth more dead than alive. And he had the most terrible thought, a thought that no one should ever have. He went to the bridge over Bedford Falls River. He looked down at the icy waters, and he was going to jump in. Now, at that point, the film freeze frames. And what George doesn't know is that in the town, people have known the situation, and they're all praying for him. Please, God, help George Bailey. Please, God, be with George Bailey. George Bailey's a good man. He helped me. Please help him. And all these prayers are going up to heaven at an enormous velocity. So God, this time, sends down an angel. But the angel looks like a little old man. He doesn't look anything like an angel. And the little angel jumps into the water before George Bailey can get in there. And so George jumps in the water too, but this time to save a life, not to take his own life. So after they go through the process of getting out, getting dried off, and George is convinced by the angel that he is actually an angel, he starts complaining again. Why did I stay in this town? I could have done this. I could have done that. Everyone else has had success. Look at me. I spent all my life here, and look, I'm going to go to prison and have a criminal record. What is this all about? And the very important thing I almost forgot is that he said, it would have been better if I hadn't been born. So the angel thought, I'm going to take this opportunity, and I am going to show you what the world would be like if you had never been born. Off you go back into your town and have a look. So George goes into the town, and it's no longer called Bedford Falls. The town is called Pottersville, after the most evil, twisted, greedy, unpleasant man you could imagine, who'd been after the Building and Loan Society for years. He has got control of the town. People who were decent, nice people were twisted and bitter, and the town was just absolutely a den of criminal activity. You wouldn't have wanted to set foot in this town, let alone raise your children in it. And George was astonished. Little did he know that his little Building and Loan Society had been the only pillar of decency in that town for all those years. The next big shock was that in this scenario, his brother Harry had died. Because when they were children, he'd fallen into a pond of water, and George wasn't there to jump in to save him. So he died. And not only did he die, but the 300 or 400 men that he'd saved during the Second World War also perished because Harry wasn't there to save them, because George wasn't there to save Harry. And he goes, there's loads of other things that he discovers, and he just realizes after all of this that he's had a wonderful life. That staying in Bedford Falls had actually made an enormous difference, and that he had actually had a part in saving all those people and being that war hero. He had done all those things, and he didn't even know. So he wanted his life back, and of course it all was well, it ended well. Ladies, I think I have to tell you this one because I think you'll understand where I'm coming from. The wife in scenario 2 is an old maid. An old maid. And the old maid is wearing the most dowdy clothes you can imagine, horrible clothes. And she's got little glasses, even though her vision was perfect when she was married to George Bailey in scenario 1. Somehow it was very bad in scenario. So that's the only thing. I think that's kind of amusing. We've moved a little way along from the 1940s. But anyway, the message is it's not necessary to go far and abroad to do great things. You can do them right here at home. Going away and making a great big splash all over the place isn't for everybody. And of course, real life is not a straight path. It's got loose ends. They're not tied up. I think that God has planned a route for us. And I think it is a pretty straight route. But we always have the choice whether or not we want to stay on it. And I think most of us meander off. You know, that's just the way we are. We'll go along straight for a little bit, then we'll do something, we'll miss a signpost and we'll wander off. And then maybe God will plant a signpost saying, time to go back this way. We'll see it, we'll go back, we'll stay on it for a little bit. And so we spend our life meandering on and off that path. The scary thing is that when you meander a little bit and you don't pay attention to the signpost and you choose to ignore it, then you go a little bit further. And then you ignore more signposts, and you find yourself drifting and drifting away towards a place that's actually quite dark and dangerous, where we're vulnerable. And finding your way back becomes harder and harder. That is scary because God will let us do that. We have the free will. He's not going to come pick us up and put us back on the route. We have to do that for ourselves. He'll put loads of signposts for us, but it's up to us whether or not we pay attention to them. Real life is not a Hollywood script, folks, as well we know. And sometimes our right moments involve really big decisions. You know, you can recognize them. Is it time to get married? Is it time to go to university? You know, some of these are really big decisions that are life-changing, and you know they're going to be life-changing. But sometimes the little tiny things that we do every day that you don't even notice are so important. Now, my final story that I'm going to tell you is, this time it's true, and it's about a real person who really lived in real life. This is about a man called Leonard, and he, like George Bailey, grew up in a small town, only on the opposite side of the world, in a little village in the hills of County Tyrone in Northern Ireland. Now, Leonard's life was go to school until you're 14, no such thing as college, that's not going to happen. Go and get yourself a trade. When you reach the right age, get yourself a nice girl, settle down, get married, and start your own cycle of life. And Leonard was fine with that. That was the rhythm of life from the village that he came from, and he was quite happy to do that. So he did all of those things except the last. He did meet a nice girl, and he decided he was going to marry her. Her name was Barbara. But then the war broke out, and he joined up. So he had to make a decision. Is it time to marry? Is it time to not marry and wait till I get back? Well, realistically, he didn't know if he was ever going to come back. And he didn't want to leave a young widow, so he decided it was not the time to get married. And off he went. He joined the parachute regiment, so he was jumping out of planes pretty often. And sometimes he didn't know if he was going to reach the ground or not. He'd always been a religious man. He went to church, and it was kind of like on a rota where you were born into this faith, you didn't question it, you just sort of went to the church, went through the motions, and that's what he'd done. But when he was in this situation where his life was in danger every day, where he didn't know that the people he'd sit down to breakfast with would be coming home at the evening and often didn't, he didn't know if he would see the sunset or the sunrise, and he found himself talking to God in a way that he had never spoken to him before. It was much more personal. He would look in the Bible, he would read it when he could, but he found himself talking to God as a friend. And the relationship grew stronger and stronger all the time that he was away. And his prayers to God were not, please God, make me live through this day. It was always, if it be your will, because he knew that all the other men that were around him, that God loved them just as much as he loved him. So he didn't ask for any special favors. Well, he did live. He lived without injury. He came home, and he found that his fiancée, Barbara, had married someone else. But you know what? He was relieved because he'd grown up so much when he was away that he realized that Barbara didn't really know him at all, and he certainly felt he didn't really know her either. It wasn't time to get married. He'd made the right decision. But pretty soon it would be. And that happened pretty soon after he went into the village one day, and the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen came out of the corner shop. She had long dark hair, she had big blue eyes and a smile like a Hollywood actress. And he said, How in a village this size have I never seen this girl before? How could this happen? Who is she? Well, her name was Elizabeth, and the reason that he hadn't noticed her before was that Elizabeth had been a child when he left. Maybe 12, 13, and she was now grown up, and he realized how much of his youth he had lost. Now, Elizabeth and Leonard were thrown together a lot because they had lots of mutual friends, and they did end up getting married. They fell in love, and they stayed together for their whole lives. But they decided, because of the way that Leonard had started worshiping, he'd been talking to God rather than sort of reading out of prayer books, and he couldn't go back to the old way because it no longer suited him. And he was looking for something new, and Elizabeth agreed she wanted something new as well. And the closest thing they could find was a little Baptist community that had sort of sprung up in the town. So they associated themselves with that. They went to church, they had prayer meetings, and those were happy days for them. And now is coming the tiny, tiny little insignificant thing that happened that changed everything. They went shopping. Can you believe that? They went shopping. Leonard found a big bookstall, and on the bookstall was a second-hand book called Bible Readings for the Home Circle. It was enormous, and it looked like it had been from the last century. It was all dusty, and it didn't look like much. But he was drawn to that book, and he picked it up, and he thought, yeah, I'm going to buy this. It was time to buy a book. So he took the book back home, and he read it. And you know what? The more he read that book, the more astonished he became. There were ideas in there that he had never thought of, but he thought were amazing. Like, for example, worship on the Sabbath would be on a Saturday instead of a Sunday. And he thought, Well, why wouldn't it be? That makes perfect sense. And there was a load of different ideas through that book. And Leonard said to Elizabeth, if I ever find the church that wrote this book, I'm going to join it immediately. And Elizabeth said, and I'm coming with you. But it was going to be years and years and years before they found that church. Long, long time. Because pretty soon after that, their second little boy was born. Little baby, he was born at home. And about a week after he was born, he was in his grandma's arms and he stopped breathing. And the grandma was completely distraught. She brought him to Elizabeth and she said, Elizabeth, the baby's not breathing. What are we going to do? And they did their best to revive him. Leonard ran to get the doctor, but there was nothing that could be done. Little Samuel, their little baby, couldn't be revived. He was gone. And their hearts were breaking. Leonard couldn't understand how when I went to war and there was bullets and bombs everywhere and I survived that and this little innocent baby didn't. How can this be? And they meandered off. And they meandered off to the place that you should never go, that dark, dark place. Everything, it was as if they'd all shut down and gone to sleep. And I think what made it worse was that they had never changed their church membership. So they went back to their original church to try and get a funeral for their little boy. But because the baby hadn't been christened, they weren't allowed to bury that child on consecrated ground. So they had to bury the child in an old, overgrown graveyard that nobody ever went to. It wasn't very nice. And it just absolutely tore them to pieces. They couldn't stand being in the house, so they sold it, and they moved into a little council house that was further into the village, and they stayed there for the rest of their lives. It was to be 10 years before something happened to wake them up. In 10 years' time, Elizabeth found she was having another baby. Now, this time it was a little girl, and despite her worries and fears, the little girl survived and was strong and well, and with every gurgle and every smile and everything that a little baby does, they were renewed again. They didn't go back to church. They had their Bibles open, but those days were finished. They couldn't go back. And then 8 more years rattled along, and then the second seemingly insignificant thing happened. One day there was a knock on their door, and a bookseller came along. And the bookseller had all kinds of religious books, but Elizabeth didn't want them. But there were a set of books for children called Uncle Arthur's Bedtime Stories. So she bought the books for her little girl because her little girl was great at reading and loved it. And she read those books over and over and over again. And she just loved that the children would pray and these great things would happen. And this went on for years. The bookseller would come to the door. Elizabeth would buy some books for her child. And this went on until the day when they decided that the little girl was kind of too old for those books. So what they did was that the last time the bookseller came, it was actually Leonard who answered the door. He brought him in, sat him down. They had a great chat. And 2 or 3 hours passed. They were talking about God and faith and all kinds of things that Leonard hadn't spoken about for years. And somehow he just woke up just like that. So the bookseller handed him a book and he said, look, I want you to read this. I'm not going to charge you for it. Just have a read and I'll come back in a month's time and then you can tell me how you got on. The book was called Steps to Christ. So Leonard read that book. And while he was reading it, he kept thinking about the other book, Bible Readings for the Home Circle. There was something oddly familiar here. And he thought, could this be the time? So when the bookseller came back, his name was Tony, by the way, Leonard said to him, look, I have to ask you this. Do you know what this book is? Have you ever seen this book? And the bookseller said, yeah, it's one of our books. It's a bit old and tatty, but yeah, it's one of our books. And then the whole thing came tumbling out. It belonged to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The nearest church was in Londonderry, the actual town that he'd went to where he'd bought it originally. And within a week, they were in that church, and 6 months later, they were baptized, all of them. Now, in case you haven't figured out already, Leonard and Elizabeth were my parents. It was time to buy a book. And because they bought that book, here I am in front of you today. and I apologize for that. But it opened doors that, at the time, God knew. He knew what the book meant. And I think he always sees the end from the beginning. I discovered Newbold College and never would have done that had it not been for that book. And I married an amazing man that I've been married to for 31 years. And I've had the privilege of serving as the head teacher at the school next door. I've been in there for 7 years, 2 of them teaching, and the rest as the head teacher. And that's a tremendous privilege and an honor that I would never have had it not been time for Leonard to buy that book. It boils down to this. It was the right time to buy a book. My final thoughts for you today. Do not worry about the meandering. We all do that. Everybody in this room has done that. And if anyone tells you they haven't, they need to seriously reassess what's going on in their lives. We're none of us perfect, and we will meander off. But what we need to do is look for those signposts to show you the road back. Look for them. They're there. Go out, find that bookstall, buy your book in whatever form that takes for your life. Thank you for listening.